The JFK airport was bustling as usual, with passengers rushing to their gates, some eager to get home and others setting out on new adventures. Among them was 17-year-old Barron Trump, the son of the President of the United States, Donald Trump. Dressed casually in a navy blue hoodie and jeans, he blended in more than one would expect from a first son. Barron was no stranger to traveling in luxury. He had grown up flying on private jets and first-class cabins, but today he was flying commercial. It wasn't a necessity but a choice. He wanted to experience travel like an ordinary American, something his mother, Melania Trump, had encouraged. As he approached his gate 43, he noticed a group of elderly men and women gathered near the waiting area. They weren't just any passengers. They wore caps embroidered with the words Korean War Veteran and Vietnam Veteran, their weathered faces holding years of sacrifice. Some stood tall, while others leaned on canes or sat in wheelchairs. One man in particular caught Barron's eye. He was in his late 80s, dressed in a neatly pressed brown blazer adorned with military medals. His thin frame and trembling hands told a story of time's relentless march, yet his blue eyes still held a spark of determination. Barron stepped closer, catching a bit of the conversation. The man, Jim Callahan, was excitedly talking to another veteran about their long-awaited honor flight to Washington, D.C., a trip sponsored by organizations to honor aging veterans with a visit to war memorials built in their name. Just then, the airline staff began boarding announcements, starting with first-class passengers. Barron checked his ticket, seat 1A, first class. But as he turned to head toward the jet bridge, he saw Jim struggling to stand up from the chair. "Here, let me help you, sir," Barron said, instinctively reaching out. Jim smiled. "Oh, thank you, son. These old bones don't move as fast as they used to." Barron helped him steady himself and saw him glance at his own boarding pass. Seat 29C, economy class, middle seat. A thought struck Barron. Here was a man who had fought for the country, who had once been strong and young like himself, who had endured hardships beyond imagination. Yet he was about to squeeze into an uncomfortable middle seat on a long flight. Barron made a decision that would soon capture the hearts of millions. Barron hesitated for only a second before making up his mind. Some things were more important than comfort, more important than status. As Jim slowly made his way toward the economy boarding line, Barron turned toward the airline staff at the gate. "Excuse me," he said to the attendant. "Would it be possible to switch my first-class seat with a passenger in economy?" The attendant, a woman in her mid-40s with a professional yet kind demeanor, looked surprised. "Sir, you have a first-class ticket. Are you sure you want to downgrade?" Barron nodded, then glanced toward Jim, who was now waiting behind a few other veterans. "I'd like to give my seat to that gentleman over there." The attendant followed his gaze, her eyes landing on the elderly veteran with his medals gleaming under the airport lights. She blinked, as if processing the magnitude of the gesture, then smiled. "That's incredibly generous of you. Let me see what I can do." Barron waited patiently as the airline staff made arrangements. Meanwhile, a few passengers nearby had overheard the exchange and started murmuring. Some whispered, recognizing Barron, while others just seemed impressed by the young man's kindness. A few moments later, the attendant returned, now beaming. "We've made the switch. Seat 1A is now Mr. Callahan's." Barron thanked her and turned toward Jim. "Sir," he said, stepping closer, "I wanted to thank you for your service. Please take my seat in first class. You deserve it far more than I do." Jim blinked, his eyes widening as he processed what Barron had just said. "Son, you're giving up your seat for me?" Barron nodded. "Absolutely." The old veteran seemed stunned for a moment. He opened his mouth to protest, then stopped. A visible lump formed in his throat as he looked at the young man before him. Barron wasn't just the son of the president. He was simply an American who understood respect. I don't know what to say," Jim finally whispered. His voice cracked with emotion, and his hands trembled slightly. That's the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a long time." Tears welled up in the old man's eyes as he gripped Barron's hand with both of his own, shaking it firmly. The surrounding passengers, who had witnessed the moment, began clapping softly, their admiration growing. A man in the crowd pulled out his phone and started recording, while another woman wiped away a tear. Barron simply smiled. "Enjoy the flight, sir." Jim cleared his throat, still trying to contain his emotions. "You're a good kid. Thank you, truly." As Jim was escorted toward the first-class cabin, Barron took his new seat, 29C, economy class, squeezed between two strangers. But he didn't mind at all, because some seats are worth giving up, and some gestures are worth more than luxury. As the passengers settled into their seats, the buzz from Barron's gesture hadn't faded. People whispered, exchanged glances, and a few even stole quick photos, though Barron paid no attention. He adjusted himself in the cramped middle seat of row 29, a stark contrast to the luxurious first-class cabin he had just given up. Up in seat 1A, Jim Callahan sat in awe. The plush leather seat, the extra legroom, the warm towel offered by the flight attendant. It was all foreign to him. He had flown many times in his life, but never like this. One of the first-class passengers sitting across from Jim leaned over. "That was the president's son, wasn't it?" Jim nodded, still gripping his boarding pass as if it were a medal of honor. "Yes, and let me tell you something. He's got more heart than some men twice his age." The flight attendants, having heard about the switch, went out of their way to make Jim comfortable. One brought him a hot cup of coffee, another adjusted his seat's recline for him, and a third simply smiled and said, "Thank you for your service, sir." Meanwhile, back in economy class, Barron sat quietly. The man seated to his left, a businessman in his late 40s, turned to him. "Kid, that was a hell of a thing you did back there." Barron shrugged modestly. It was the right thing to do. The woman on his right, who had been watching the scene unfold, chimed in. "A lot of people talk about respect for veterans, but very few show it. Your parents must be proud." Barron simply smiled, looking down at his hands. His parents, especially his father, the president, were always in the headlines, but for different reasons. He hadn't done this for attention. He had done it because it felt right. As the plane taxied down the runway and took off into the night sky, a soft chime came over the intercom. The flight captain's voice crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a special guest aboard our flight tonight, Mr. James Callahan, a decorated Korean War veteran, traveling on an honor flight to Washington, D.C. We'd like to take a moment to thank him and all our veterans for their service to this great nation." A wave of applause erupted throughout the cabin. Some passengers even stood up, clapping louder. Jim, sitting in first class, wiped at his eyes with the sleeve of his blazer. Barron, seated in economy, smiled to himself. This was his real reward. But the story was far from over. As the applause slowly faded, the passengers returned to their conversations, but the energy on the flight had changed. People weren't just on a plane anymore. They were part of a moment, a memory being made in real time. Up in first class, Jim Callahan sipped his coffee, still processing everything. He had spent most of his life fighting, working, and raising a family, and moments like these, where he felt truly seen, were few and far between. A flight attendant approached him with a warm smile. "Mr. Callahan, we have a surprise for you." She handed him a handwritten note on an airline napkin. Jim adjusted his reading glasses and unfolded it carefully. The note read, "To Mr. Callahan, thank you for your service. We owe you more than we could ever repay. Enjoy this small comfort, you deserve it. With respect, Barron Trump." Jim's hands shook slightly as he read it. He glanced toward the economy cabin, where Barron sat casually listening to music through his headphones. The young man wasn't looking for recognition. He wasn't waiting for thanks. He had simply done something good and moved on. Jim took a deep breath, then turned to the man seated beside him, a well-dressed executive who had witnessed everything. "I'm an old man," Jim said, chuckling softly. "But that boy, he's got the kind of character this country needs." The executive nodded. "You don't see that kind of humility in kids his age, especially not someone from a family like his." Meanwhile, back in row 29, Barron noticed that passengers were stealing glances at him, some smiling, some whispering. The businessman to his left finally spoke again. "Kid, I don't know if you realize this yet, but that moment back there? That's gonna stick with people." Barron chuckled. "I just gave up a seat." The businessman shook his head. "No, you reminded people what real respect looks like. You reminded them that titles and wealth don't make a man. It's the choices he makes." As the flight continued, a few more passengers from first class made their way down the aisle, stopping briefly at row 29 to whisper words of gratitude to Barron. One older woman gently squeezed his shoulder and said, "Your grandfather would be proud." Barron smiled softly. His grandfather, Fred Trump, had built a real estate empire, but more than that, he had instilled values in his family. Barron never got to know him well, but at that moment he hoped he was watching. Unbeknownst to him, a man 3 rows back had recorded the entire exchange at the gate and uploaded it to Twitter. The caption read, "Barron Trump just gave up his first-class seat for an elderly war veteran. No cameras, no press, just pure kindness. This is what America should be about." Within minutes, the post started gaining traction. But Barron, unaware of the storm brewing on social media, simply leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the hum of the airplane lull him into a peaceful sleep. Little did he know the world was already watching. By the time the plane landed at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, Barron Trump had no idea that his simple act of kindness had already become a nationwide sensation. As he stepped off the plane, walking behind the other passengers, he noticed more people looking at him, some smiling, some giving him small nods of respect. It was subtle, but the energy had shifted. Up ahead, Jim Callahan was greeted by a group of volunteers from the Honor Flight Network, waving small American flags. Several veterans from the flight gathered near him, sharing handshakes and laughter as they prepared for their visit to the war memorials. Just as Barron was about to head toward baggage claim, Jim turned and called out to him, "Son, come here a second." Barron walked up to him, hands casually in his hoodie pockets. "Yes, sir." Jim's eyes glistened with emotion as he held out a military challenge coin, a special token often exchanged between service members as a symbol of respect and gratitude. "This is for you," Jim said. "It ain't much, but I want you to have it." Barron looked at the coin, running his fingers over its detailed engraving of the United States Army insignia. "Sir, Jim cut him off with a firm shake of the head. "Don't argue, son. You've earned it." Barron swallowed hard, then took the coin and gripped it tightly in his palm. "Thank you, sir. This means a lot." Jim chuckled. "No, son. Thank you." As they exchanged one final handshake, a small crowd had gathered nearby. Travelers, veterans, and even airport staff who had caught wind of the story. A few started clapping, then more joined in, until the entire area was filled with applause. Barron, slightly embarrassed by the attention, simply nodded politely and smiled. He turned to head toward the exit, but that was when his phone started vibrating. He pulled it out and saw dozens of notifications flooding his screen. Texts, missed calls, social media alerts. Something was happening. His mother, Melania Trump, had texted, "Proud of you. Call me when you land. Red heart." Then, a message from his father. "Good job, kid. People are talking." Curious, Barron tapped open Twitter. Hashtag Barron Trump was trending. The video of him giving up his seat had gone viral. It had been shared by celebrities, veterans, and even political figures on both sides. News outlets had already picked up the story, running headlines like, "Small Blue Diamond, Barron Trump's act of kindness brings a veteran to tears. Small Blue Diamond character over privilege. The first son's simple yet powerful gesture. Small Blue Diamond, Barron Trump honors a hero, America takes notice." His brows raised in mild surprise. He had never sought the spotlight, but it seemed that, for once, the attention was for something genuinely good. Just then, an elderly woman standing nearby touched his arm. "Young man, I saw what you did back there. That was beautiful. Your parents raised you right." Barron smiled warmly. "Thank you, ma'am." As he walked toward the airport exit, he thought about the seat he had given up, the handshake with Jim, the weight of the challenge coin now sitting in his pocket. It wasn't about the viral fame. It wasn't about the applause. It was about something much bigger than himself. Because at the end of the day, respect, kindness, and gratitude never go unnoticed. And sometimes the smallest gestures leave the greatest impact.